Welcome to another season of Positivity with Paul. I'm Paul Candola, and I find fellow actuaries, pun intended, for a conversational Q&A on their life. The focus is on their journey along the actuarial exam path and beyond, some of the challenges they faced, and how those challenges helped shape them to become who they are today. To give some brief context on becoming an actuary, there's a number of actuarial exams that one has to go through. These exams are very rigorous and typically only the top 40% pass at each sitting. They cover complex mathematical topics like statistics and financial modeling, but also insurance, investments, regulatory, and accounting. Candidates can study up to 5 months per sitting and usually take 7 to 10 years on average to earn their fellowship degree. To that end, I launched this series of podcasts because I was curious about what drove my guests to surmount trials and tribulations to get to the end goal of becoming an actuary. My guest in this interview is Didier Serre. Didier is a consulting actuary with climate, sustainability, and risk knowledge. He's also a continuous learner who loves helping others. Currently, Didier is assisting organizations with climate risk assessment, scenario analysis, and resilience planning to guide strategic thinking and value creation in a changing world. His research interests include looking at how key sectors may be reshaped in the long term by technology disruptors, changing demographics, and stakeholder behaviors given the volatile climate forecasted ahead. Didier has several years of global experience in traditional actuarial roles in insurance, reinsurance, and health economics consulting. He's also an active member of the Catastrophe and Climate Strategy Research Committee at the Society of Actuaries. Hope you enjoy this magnificent meeting. Here, welcome Didier.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, thanks for coming on board, and really happy to have you on.
Same here. I think this is probably the first podcast that I'm a part of. So I look forward to sharing some of my experiences with you and your audience as well.
Awesome. Yeah, hopefully not the last either, right?
The first of many.
That's it, for first of many, and I got to start somewhere. So this is the first. Nice. I'm lucky to be part of it. uh, so tell us how you found out about actuarial science first and get started in it.
So that's the key question. Did actual science find me, or did I find actual science myself?
That's it.
I think it was a bit of both. So from an early on, and I was naturally inclined to numbers, working with numbers, and just I was enjoying mathematics. I think in general, and when I say it goes way back. I'm talking elementary school. I enjoyed numbers, but it was more the mental math aspect of it. So quick calculations in my mind, or trying to find shortcuts to get to a ballpark estimate. I just liked numbers in general. So I'm thinking that inclination for math and then later on statistics then allowed me, or in a way just made me look at careers where I could use and numbers. So that's one aspect. But also I think in high school, when I think in Quebec where I'm based, in the fourth or fifth year of high school, we have this course that just preps you to think about your big career ahead of you, and that's the first time I heard about the word actuary. I had no clue before what that word meant, but in one of my courses, thinking and looking at ways where I could apply math and stats later on, and numbers, that's when the word actuary came up. And then I did a bit of research as a 16, I think, or 17-year-old of what really that meant. And then I engaged with an actuary at the time. I just reached out to an actuary I found online, and then had a 1 hour conversation. But that was the very start of me wanting to pursue that path.
Awesome. Nice. Actually, I was kind of interested, like having that knack for math. and figuring the shortcuts out. Did you figure the shortcuts out? Was it yourself, like just working with the numbers, and then that helped with the exams over time?
So that's a good question. I don't know if it helped, because the type of math I was interested as a kid was not necessarily the same type of math or that you would necessarily use later on, in actual exam, or at least I didn't necessarily make the connection. But just to give you an example, we're going way back, but I was probably in my last year of elementary school, and there was a contest where we had to estimate the number of candies in a very big candy jar, and whoever was closest would get. I can't remember what the prize was. It could have been the actual candy jar or something else. And so I remember the candy jar getting passed around the class, and everyone had to enter their guess estimate. And so people, I think probably everyone had their own technique, but already from the start, I would try to compute I would try to, well, I didn't try, I actually counted the number of candies on one row, and then also estimated how many rows there would be. Again, I probably counted them. And then from there, I used those two findings and maybe some other techniques that I had developed at the time to provide the estimate that I thought would be closest to the actual response. And that year, I ended up guessing right. I was the closest, but it was trying to find clues in the absence of, I guess, perfect information, or in the absence of having the time to compute and to manually count the candies in the jar. So I guess in that respect, if I relate to actual exams are exactly that. It's trying to find a way to get to either the actual response answer or close enough, and then showing that you have the supporting arguments to back up your claims, and then showing your train of thought to get to that response. And so in a way, there might be a link, but I think at the time I was writing my exam, I did not necessarily realize that I may have been onto something when I was 12, counting those candies.
Yeah. I'm wondering, did you compare it to the pi r squared formula
I
for?
I would have loved to say yes, but I don't think I was. I can't remember, but I don't think I was familiar with pi either. But I may
Unless
have
it had
come
to
up
be a
with,
circle jar, right?
yes, but I may have come up with my own ways. But again, it was just trying to to to, to be smart in how I would approach this problem, knowing that counting the number of candies was not an option, because I would have delayed the whole class. Everyone wanted to have the candy jar to have in their hands to estimate how many there would be. So, but it was trying to come up quickly with an estimate that I felt comfortable with, and then trying to find a shortcut that would get me to an amount that I thought would get me close to the prize.
Compare that to the actuarial exams, the more difficult questions relatively in the exams where you think it out more and bringing in like practicality to that sort of the brute force method is what you're implying, right?
Right. I mean, I have to say regarding exams, it's easier for me now in hindsight to talk about it, but I think while you're in, studying for those exams, I think I may have fallen in the trap of focusing a lot, almost exclusively, on exam content, so on the technical aspects that you will be, or I would be tested on, and probably not realizing that I should have maybe spent a bit more time on just learning how to even approach sitting a time constrained exam with high pressure, with a high number of questions. And I feel like if I had to go back or these things a bit differently, I would make sure to allocate a portion of my time to non-technical skills, such as time management. That's definitely a key one, but also understanding, okay, what are the key factors behind succeeding in a time constrained exam, or exam sitting where there's a number of questions and then only a limited amount of time. And so I would not discard the importance of learning both about the technical and the content of the exam, but also about developing techniques to make sure that you're able actually to retrieve all that wealth of information that you may have accumulated the past 3-4 months, and then create an environment that's conducive for high performance.
It's a really interesting point that you bring, and I think one of the things that's underrated about actuaries is that high performance optimization techniques for studying we really have embedded within us. Kind of interested, what was your routine like for studying?
Yeah, no, I think it's funny because routine are definitely, I think, personal. I think you can ask 10 people what their routines are, and then you're likely to get 10 different answers. So I would say to our audience, it's just don't be afraid to try many routines and see which one works for you the most. And if you already know, that's great. Stick to that. You probably know best what works for you. But in my case, I'm a morning person, and I'm not necessarily someone who would go to bed too late or would be able to study late in the evening. So generally, I would try to do it before work, get some time in, and then obviously if I need to go to work during the day or to study, I would have to pause. But I would try to do it in chunks of maybe 3.5 hours, and then get a solid an hour, sometimes 2 hour break, just to really clear my mind. And then obviously if it happened to work during some of my exams, so I would also have to resume after work. But I try not to study too late. I would much rather wake up early or earlier the next day and get a couple hours in. That's what I thought would work best for me. So that was my routine. Again, you mentioned a really good point, Paul, and it made me think of efficiency. And again, if I had to do things differently, I think I was always focused on the number of hours that I would be studying rather than the outcome that I was hoping to achieve. And obviously there's a correlation, because the more you study, hopefully you will reap more rewards. But at some point, that's when if efficiency or inefficiencies come into place. And that's something I've been working recently and in the recent past, just to shift my perspective and think less in terms of hours. I mean, obviously it's good to know how long things will take, but also think in terms of outcomes. What is it that I want to achieve in my next study sitting? And then go from there, because then that helps to build a goal. And you may also want to set yourself a time boundary. So you only have 3 hours to achieve this outcome. But one of my difficulties sometimes would be to know that I would be studying for X number of hours, but then without necessarily having clear goals as to concretely, if I were to break it down into fewer steps, what is it that I wanted to achieve within that study sitting. So yeah, it's constant learning. Even after you pass all those exams, you're still learning.
For sure, yeah. It's just the tip of the iceberg, and it's just sort of learning how to learn is the concept that goes forward, right? Now that we've gone through the exam process and talking about bettering ourselves the next time around, how did you go about improving on the first time you failed your exam, and what steps did you make better?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think it's a good question. And talking about failures or obstacles or hurdles, I think it's really important just for our audience, but even for ourselves. I think just accepting that it's okay not to have it from the first try. And actually, when you look at the stats, you'll realize that you're not alone. Some of the passing rates for some of the fellowship exams towards the end, actually, I think the success rate is around like just above 30%. So you're definitely not alone. But I think it's good to manage those expectations and to talk about obstacles and hurdles, because again, looking at stats, it's likely that you will encounter those as a future, if you're looking at having a career in actual science. So in my case, the curriculum has been changing. Just to give everyone, some perspective. I wrote my first exam in 2010, in my first year of uni, and graduated a few years later, about 3 years ago. So it was a long journey with some gaps and breaks in between, as I did some additional studies. But at the time I was studying for actual exam, there were two broad categories of exams, and the curriculum may have changed a bit, but there were some what we called, I think, preliminary exams that would lead to the associateship, and then we would have the fellowship exams. And so the preliminary exams for me went fairly well. I passed all 5 exams in 6 sittings, so I was quite happy with the way things were progressing. But I think you can feel like where this is going. Then I kind of hit the wall after my associateship when I had to start writing those fellowship exams. So I passed all 3 fellowships exam in the end over 6 sittings. So definitely took me a bit more time to get through all these hurdles. But the first time around, I think I just wasn't ready for that transition from I think what used to be a multiple choice exam to a essay-based written exam over 5 or 6 hours, morning and afternoon sitting. So that transition from multiple choice to written exam, I think I hadn't managed it properly. Or at least the expectation around how it would be. So that's the first time I wrote it, I failed. And then I think time management, I was struggling a lot. I was trying too often to get the perfect answer to a particular question. And obviously that came at the expense of not having enough time to finish all the questions. And so what I learned from my first failure was, so I got my results back. I got a 4, not great. But I didn't just look at my score. I also looked at my individual score for each question. So now you can tell this is an actuary talking, looking at distribution. And what that taught me was that I was basically scoring 9 and 10 or 8, 9 and 10 really, really well on some questions. And I was scoring really, really low on some other questions. And actually, some of them, I didn't even have time to answer any answers or to write any answers, in which case I got a 0. Then that gave me some inputs. I knew where to look. I was doing extremely well, but then I didn't have enough time to finish. And so the second time around, I thought, well, I need to work on time management. I need to time myself so that after a given number of minutes, I need to move on to the next question. And if that means I get a 7 in one question, well, then that's fine. I can make sure I can secure additional 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 on other questions. And so that's how I learned. It's really by looking at my past performance, seeing where things have gone well, where things did not go well, and what I can do in between sittings to change my technique, because it wasn't a question of did I study enough. I had probably put in the standard 300 to 400 study hours. So it didn't come from a lack of preparation from a study hours perspective, but I think it came from time management and going back to what I said earlier, not necessarily have an outcome in mind when I would start studying. I really worked then over time to keep an eye on the clock, really. And I had to do it. And then as I progressed over the fellowship exam, it got better and better. That was a wake-up call that I had to spend time looking at ways to make sure I could deliver on time what was expected of me.
For sure. And the time management thing is huge too. Running out of time, like sometimes it is better to spread out the wealth. I think it's 2.5 points usually per minute. You can calculate that. So if it's 15 points, what do you get? 6 minutes to do, and past that 6 minutes, it's like, all right, move on.
So when I would write it, it was 3 minutes, I think. But now 2.5 might be more accurate because I know there's been changes. But yes, my watch became my best friend as I progressed in my fellowship exam. I had to adopt a new way to go about this, because simply writing answers to a question without looking at the time was a mistake that I learned.
Yeah, us post-qualified fellow wanted to discuss the boundaries that is traditionally around actuarial science, and what would you consider in terms of a definition of that traditional boundary before we expand on that?
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's such an important question, because actuaries there's they've been around for quite some time. And when, if you, from purely a numbers perspective, I think the bulk, it's fair to say that the bulk of actuaries will work within a pension environment or a life insurance, I think, environment. These are probably the big buckets. And then obviously you also have, depending on your geographical location, but there's also health insurance in some way, shape, or form, or group health benefits that some actuaries may gravitate. Also, in parallel to pensions, some actuaries may be involved more on the asset side, so on the investment of pensions. But I think in terms of drawing the landscape, am I forgetting any? Because I'm trying to think now of all the. Oh, there's the P&C, of course. Yes, you're right. So anything that deals with, you're right, property and casualty. So if you have a house, you have a car, any type of property that you want to insure, that's another motor insurance. That's another big segment of the market. So generally these, I guess, it's fair to say that these would be the big buckets. So you have pension, insurance. You can also add reinsurance into that mix as well. Some actuaries also working for the public sector as well, for behind the scenes, but generally they will have some sort of risk management aspect to their jobs and responsibilities. Yes, and there's also, I guess, the final one would be from regulatory. So some actuaries may be involved on the regulatory sides of things, but generally this will be, again, regulating the insurance market or regulating the pension world in some way, shape, or form.
Got it. Your current background now as a climate change actuary.
That's right. Yeah, I think if my one message, I think, to your audience would be, don't let the traditional boundaries define where you'll end up. Boundaries are what you make of, and there's definitely, I think, the actual profession is slowly pushing those boundaries towards new territory. And I think this is great. I remember when I was studying for actuarial science at Concordia University in Montreal, and I remember one time the SOA, so the Society of Actuaries, they came to us to deliver a presentation, and they gave everyone a SOA pamphlet, and on it was the SOA logo, which might still be the SOA logo right now. It was called Risk is Opportunity. And so when you think that actuaries thrive on risk, this is our bread and butter in some ways. And then if you think that risk can be an opportunity, well, the same can apply to your work. There are risks in many aspects of our lives, in many sectors of our societies. And so pushing the boundaries of the profession, I think, is an opportunity for the profession to be more involved in policy work and work that we're typically less involved in, but making sure that our voice is heard and also that our expertise is being available and made to good use. So like you said, I recently pivoted into the climate space. So climate is an evolving field, not just for the actual profession, but for everyone. So it's evolving very fast. And I was very lucky or privileged or grateful, I guess, to have a chance to use my skills that I have in risk management and that I developed over the years in traditional settings, and then be able to apply those in what I call a non-traditional sector. Now, what is non-traditional today might become traditional in a few years' time. So that's what my advice to actuaries would be, to keep an eye out on the future. And obviously I'm working now in the climate space, and we're constantly looking out in the future as there are potential plausible futures that may erupt. But my one advice would be, keep that eye out on the future. Look at where the market is going, because then there might be some opportunities or opening up in that sector. But the last thing I might say, Paul, I think is you can build your actual skills and experience in both the traditional and non-traditional sectors. I think, in fact, understanding the core actuarial principles, I think, is key to then being able to apply them in a new field, in a new sector outside of the traditional actuarial world. So in no way am I suggesting that like traditional actuarial sectors should be disregarded. I think far from it. My experience has been to really learn about traditional actuarial work, trying different types of insurance. When I did a few internships, I did one in P&C, I did one in life and health, did one in pensions, I did one in pharmaceutical health benefits, to eventually end up as a health actuary for a few years. And now as a climate actuary. So I think it's good to try, and it's good to see what works, what doesn't work. And I think it's good to take a step back and see, what have I learned that is core to actual principles? And how can I apply this maybe in a slightly different way outside of the traditional boundaries of our profession? And my experience has been that there is so much relevance to the type of work that we do, even outside of our field.
Right. And yes, as long as you can apply and utilize the the actuarial control cycles, you don't have to call it that if it's non-traditional. But mainly using that in a real world setting where you have the inputs, the activities that are being done to control the inputs, and then sort of readjust as you see fit within the control cycle.
Yeah, and you know what? Let's make a parallel between what you just said, the actual control cycle. So like you said, for those that may be less familiar, the control cycle is basically a way to continuously refine. It can be a model, it can be your assumptions, but it's a mechanism or framework that is in place where you would select some inputs to produce some outputs, but then monitor over time to make sure that any type of assumptions that you may have used are still accurate. And if there needs to be some refinements, then you use the new experience to refine your assumptions. But I think that applies to our lives in general. This is learning by doing. This, if we take a step back from being an actuary, but it's about bettering ourselves. And I think definitely the past year has shown that no one's perfect, and no one's trying to be perfect. But I think our goal should be to strive to move along that continuum, learning from our past mistakes, progressing in that right direction, and be kind to ourselves. So we can apply it definitely in so many aspects of our lives where and where the feedback is then incorporated into our day-to-day. And so it's true for actuarial work, but it's also true outside of actuarial work, where we just try to continuously do better. And so I think I've over the years, I've noticed a second meaning behind some of the actual principles that we've been taught.
Yeah, totally right. Because relationships that's totally a feedback loop. You're not going to know if how someone's feeling, and let's have like an open dialogue or discussion about it as well, and kind of learn from that and grow it, and it keeps circling around. That's growth and in so many ways, right? So in terms of how an actuary can build, obviously you need the technical skills, that's regardless with the exams. How about expanding on the actuarial skill set so that what other non-technical skills can they work on that can benefit their career in the long run?
That's an excellent point. And again, I think the curriculum is now acknowledging, in universities that actuaries need to be more versatile outside of technical skills. I think in general, as a profession, I think there's a high level of expertise that's required of the profession, and I think that's also how people view the profession. I think from a technical standpoint, I think we very often will score very, very high, but where I think we could be scoring better, I think it's more in the non-technical realm. For instance, communications. That's a key one. Being able to translate something very complex, or that seems complex to non-actuaries, and then being able to translate that into layman's terms, simple terms, to a non-technical audience. I think that's key. That's key because your numbers can be right, and they probably will, and they may require a significant amount of work, modeling, interpretation, assumptions. But if at the end of the day, you need to be able to make sure that that information can be easily digested by the recipient, by your audience. And then that's a key, I think, skill to develop is make sure that you're able to synthesize the information to what's most relevant to your audience, because your audience may not necessarily need to know every single detail that you've put in your model, but they'll want to know certain things. And it's that ability to communicate that to your audience that I think will be key. And then have the backup, if you need to expand on, then you'll also have the backup and the technical skills to explain, what went behind the calculation. But being able to really digest the information for your clients or for your audience, I think is key. So that's one. Two, I think to be curious. And that's something that I've now seeing in hindsight. So it's not so much that I had developed this curiosity when I was in school. The exam took a heavy toll on time outside of work and school. But now that I'm able to, take a step back and have that time to make parallels between the things I've learned and the things that I now work on and the world around us, I think developing that curiosity of asking questions, why is it like this? Is the status quo even a good option? Challenging those assumptions, because sometimes it's easy to replicate someone else's work or to build a similar model. And it will require some technical skills, definitely. But then the question is questioning that status quo. It's being curious to understand the relationship, to understand why things are done a certain way. Because quite frankly, maybe the time has passed and maybe now things need to get refreshed, need to get done differently. So that's another skill that I think is really important, is to ask questions, to be curious and not be afraid to challenge the status quo, or at least understand why the status quo should be preserved. And then the last one, so we talked about communication, that's a big one. We talked about curiosity, status quo. And the last one, I would say to be open to, making parallels between what we do and why it's useful. And then, so I'm alluding to relevance. And it's, again, thinking about how relevant we can be or become in our societies through the technical work that we do. For instance, it could be advancing a cause or something that's dear to your heart or something that has a policy aspect. But this will require some technical expertise. So it's being able to navigate both quantitative information and qualitative. And I think it's super important for actuaries to be well versed in handling both type of data, qualitative and quantitative, and then be able to blend the two together. I now work in the climate space. There's a lot of uncertainty about climate, and I'm certainly not trying to claim that I can predict what the future holds, because we simply don't know. But being able to understand sometimes some signals in the market or some qualitative data and relate those, to be able to integrate those quantitatively and make connections between the two, I think is key, because then you can really close the loop. You can be well versed and then work with some data sources, data feeds that come from multiple perspectives. And that will, I think, enrich the type of work, the type of analysis that you do.
I'm trying to apply this to the greater good of society. For instance, like with climate change, say if you have this control loop, feedback loop, you have the data, and quite frankly, right now, maybe the data it's going to change in the future, but you're not sure like what that data is going to be. You have like different scenarios that are being run, but you take the actuals and feed that back in against the assumptions and sort of reapply. But then I guess the higher level is climate change is sort of like a global life contingency. So you're trying to make better for the underlying principles for why you're doing it is the big part of it as well.
I mean, I think it's super important when we take on a new task, a new project, like to understand, and that I think applies to not just our actuarial work, but much beyond that. It's understanding why are we even working on this particular, like understanding the objective, the relevance, and I think that's key. And as a profession, I think we're very good at understanding risk and looking at distributions, looking at extremes. But sometimes, when we hear about, sometimes goes out in the media, the world wants the conversation to be around the mean, the average, But the truth is, especially in climate, but also outside of climate, sometimes the mean is not necessarily representative of the area of possibilities in front of you. And so if you understand the question that you're trying to ask, then you can also better understand how you should formulate and communicate your findings to your audience. And so that goes back to my first point about communication. And it also, I think, allows you to understand the limitations of the data sources that you've been using, and then to draw it back always to, why am I trying to answer? What's the goal here that I'm trying to achieve? And never lose sight of that. And then in some cases, your conclusion might lead to changing the status quo, which is what I alluded to earlier, and that's fine. Or it may support the status quo, and that's also fine. But it's again, going back to this idea of whatever you do, even whether you're an entry-level position or later on, not be afraid to ask questions, be curious about why things are done a certain way. And it's not because they have been done a certain way for the past X number of years that they need to continue going forward. And so it's that ability to challenge the status quo, it's that ability to challenge the selection of assumptions. And that you can do only, I think, if you're set and focused on what you're trying to achieve. So it's really starting from the end and work your way backwards. What's your final outcome? Let's bring it down to smaller chunks, but never lose sight, I think, of the final outcome. And I'll make a quick parallel with, the actual exams that I was struggling with at some point in my life. If I make a parallel, I could have, it would have been good for me to think of, I've got 3.5 hours to complete 20 questions. And then work my way backwards to say, well, how am I going to achieve this? Well, in order to be able to answer, 20 questions in 3 hours, that assuming that I'm going to spend an equal amount of time on every question, that means spending at most X number of minutes per question. But the first time around, I didn't think of it like that. I started right from the start. I've got 20 questions. Okay, let's start with question 1 and work my way through. And so I think we can definitely become more philosophical, but I think that there's ways that all these things are interconnected.
It makes sense to get easier questions, or when you're working on a project, kind of the low-hanging fruits per se, to build upon that, more confidence on the complex parts. When you said the mean doesn't usually work, the mean usually has, in the law of large numbers, you'd have a normal distribution with a mean. Something like that could be used for a theoretical maximum, let's say, for, say, a human height or something like that, but not necessarily like solar system. Say the planets, you can't really take a mean like that. That would be an irrelevant statistic, right? Taking an average of planet size, let's say, as a broader example. If a mean wasn't used, would you be using like fractals instead, or scalars to measure?
I have to admit, I'm not sure what a fractal is, but I'll give you an example in healthcare. As I was writing actual exams, I also decided to pause and do a master's in health economics. I worked a few years in health economics and as a health actuary. And I'll give you a simple example. Healthcare costs. You're an insurer, your average member will claim X number of dollars every year. So if you use the mean, you'll be looking at that. But in healthcare, what we know is that most people don't claim because there's a high number of people who are healthy and won't claim in a given year. And so when you look at the distribution of healthcare, what you realize is that 5% of all of a population is driving 50% of all the costs, and 10% I think is driving 80%, or it could be 20%. But the bottom line is, this is disproportionate amount of people, or small number of people, driving the bulk of healthcare costs. And if you're looking at the mean, then that mean doesn't represent much, because, like I said, most people don't claim, but those who claim will claim a lot in a given year. And so it's understanding those extremes. I mentioned, earlier in my exam, the first fellowship exam that I failed, I didn't just look at my mean score, which was a 4. I looked at the distribution of my scores per question and realized I did really well and I did really badly on some questions. That gave me information. That gave me insight. That gave me feedback for me to understand how I can better myself next time around. And so it's the same thing here. It's just to be critical, like to have a critical eye to every type of numbers that we hear, that we listen, that we read about in the news, and understand, is this a representative number of the population that I'm looking at? Or should I segment my population and really understand who's driving, that average? Right. And I think again, it applies to everything in life, not just actuarial science, but really being critical and say, well, really understanding what's driving those numbers.
I think it's the Pareto Principle, where 80% of the costs to 20% of the...
Oh, the 80-20 rule. Yes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of that. Yeah. And we talked about efficiency earlier. Well, that's also something that I'm constantly trying to improve, is is how to do in 20% of the time, achieve 80% of an outcome. And leave the details, the refinements, the decoration, till the very end. But to be able to get the work done quickly, a bulk of it. Yeah. So I think distribution are everywhere. We just need to be more aware that you always looking at the average or the mean may actually not provide us with much information. Not always. Sometimes the mean gives a good overall portrait, but sometimes it's just very misleading. That's why I think it's important for actuaries to, like I said, be able to communicate, be strong technically, but also be able to call out when the data is not being interpreted the right way, or it's not being used in the way that it was intended to be used.
Some rapid fire questions as well. What's your favorite book or most donated book that you've donated?
I've gifted a book to a friend recently for his birthday, but it was a book about doing business differently. And it was authored by Mr. Chouinard, Yvan Chouinard. He's the founder of Patagonia. He grew up and probably lived all of his life in the US, and now he's in California. But it's all about the evolution of Patagonia from a shack by the beach in California to what it has become now. But keeping in mind, I think one of his core principles was always to do business differently. So obviously we live in a capitalist system. But I think Yvan Chouinard always made a point to make the business and make money in a more sustainable fashion, be a conscious stakeholder and giving back to the community. So someone gave me that book, and then I read it and I thought it was such a good book. And it's called actually Let My People Go Surfing. And so I decided to offer it to a friend of mine as well, who's now living in California, but most recent donated book.
I always like retail stories of how they've gone into starting off. Patagonia is one, Lululemon, Chip Wilson, and I think Zara as well as logistics.
And you raised a good point, because with retail and what's been fascinating is that, so I don't read many novels. I think I used to be more imaginary as a kid, but I think growing up, then I would read like I said, like a bit like more serious books. I do want to read more fiction, but one of the key learnings from reading this book was just to realize that it's an evolution, it's a process. You don't just necessarily become, sometimes you do, but sometimes it takes years. It takes time to build your clientele. It takes time. So the experience of Patagonia, they were successful even right from the start, but they were a small team. And I don't think his goal necessarily was to be big. It was just to cater to this community of, I think, surfers and then climbers initially. And it's then taking you through that journey. They've done some mistakes, and that's life, basically. It's about setting off on a path and continuing on that journey. But it's not always, rosy, and that's what I like. It's where you can be inspired or be understanding that, there will be mistakes on the way, there will be bumps, but it's your ability to get back on your feet. I think that we need to develop, and that I also work on. It's that resilience. And I find these books very, very inspirational.
Sounds like they're using the control cycle naturally too, that feedback loop.
Yes, businesses do it all the time. I think if you don't incorporate feedback from either your customers, from your investors, from the bank, or from your stakeholders, I don't think you can succeed.
For sure, yeah.
Over the long run. I think you need to be open to changing ways of doing things, to make sure you're still relevant in today's time. So absolutely, feedback loop all the way.
Awesome. The last question I have is, so what would you go back and tell your 25-year-old self now with all the wisdom throughout the years?
It's a good question. I don't need to go too far, less than 5 to 10 years. So so I think that still gives me a bit of hindsight. So at 25, I was still completing my exams. Advice to my old self would be not to take life too seriously. I think it's easier now to say it after I'm done with all these exams, but I think I almost shut down from the rest of the world as I was studying, working, and obviously I had a social life, but there were some boundaries. I didn't let my creativity, wander or roam. as much as, maybe in my earlier years. And now I'm catching up. But it was just to be, I think my advice to my old self would be, don't take life too seriously. And it's not because you're writing exams that you need to completely shut down from the rest of the world. And keep that creativity going. Maintain some interest and hobbies even while you're studying. I know a lot of my friends, including myself, have started hobbies after writing our exams. But I know very few who have maintained or started hobbies as they were writing their exams. And I think it's important to keep the balance. And then, like I said, life is short. We need to take those obstacles with a grain of salt, because they will happen, but we will get past them. And it's making sure that we keep a smile, even when we study, and we keep that curiosity going all the time.
Didier, I really appreciate your time and coming on today and telling us about your experience throughout the actuarial exam process. And thank you again. Really, really appreciate the time, and we'll definitely keep in touch going forward.
Well, thank you, Paul, so much for your invitation. And I think what you're doing is great to interview actuaries so we can share our experience. I have this platform, and keep up the good work, and can't wait to catch up with you next.
For sure. Thanks.